Okay, let's unpack this. We are doing a deep dive into history today. And not just long history, but history on a scale that, well, it fundamentally redefines what we even consider ancient. The mission is to pull the most powerful insights from your sources on the first peoples of the Australian continent. We're talking Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders. We're looking for the proof, the evidence that this was one of the world's most enduring and culturally sophisticated human civilizations, long, long before any Europeans arrived.
It's a crucial mission. It really is. Because the sources, right away, they just challenge the conventional, the Eurocentric historical timelines that we're all taught.
Right.
What these documents show is the archaeological and cultural evidence for one of the longest continuous cultural histories on Earth. So when we say civilization, we have to look beyond, stone cities or written records.
Right.
We have to look at sustained cultural knowledge, ecological mastery, and just sheer longevity.
And the first thing that jumps out from these documents is that sheer, overwhelming scale. The timeline. Here's where it gets really interesting. The starting point for human habitation on the continent is estimated somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago.
Yeah.
That range alone, that's tens of thousands of years. It's almost impossible to really wrap your head around, but it is the foundation for everything else.
That is the essential context. You have to start there. We are talking about a point so far in the past that much of the Northern Hemisphere was still, locked in an ice age.
Wow.
And the mechanism for how they first arrived, it was complex. It was all about migration routes across land masses and short sea crossings from what we now call Southeast Asia. The geography of the globe was just fundamentally different.
So lower sea level.
Much lower sea levels. It exposed these vast continental shelves, and that connected major landmasses into a supercontinent called Sahul.
So people weren't like crossing huge stretches of open ocean in canoes the way we might picture it today.
Right.
It was more island hopping across a very different looking world.
Exactly. They were navigating these relatively short gaps, maybe 50 to 100 kilometers, and then just walking across these enormous land bridges.
Okay.
And what's fascinating here is that the sources really get into the academic debate around this. We just don't know for sure if the ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians arrived in one single big wave.
Or what, multiple waves.
Or if there were multiple distinct waves of immigration over thousands of years. And all of them would have contributed to the genetic diversity that we see today. It's a huge question.
It's like a detective story that's played out over millennia. And we have these anchors, these pieces of proof for that antiquity. Your sources point to two absolutely vital archaeological sites. First up, the Medjugorje Rock Shelter in Arnhem Lands.
Mm-hmm.
This site, based on the dating of the stone tools and artifacts they found, it's considered possibly the oldest archaeological site showing human presence on the continent. It pushes the dates right up to that 65,000-year mark.
Medjugorje is absolutely key. It is. And it's because it uses these very modern dating techniques, optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, on the sediments around the artifacts. But, while that site establishes the earliest human activity,
Right.
the Lake Mungo remains in New South Wales provide an even more profound piece of evidence for you, for the listener.
Okay, so tell us why. Why is Lake Mungo so critical?
Well, Lake Mungo is where the oldest human remains in Australia were found. They're dated to around 42,000 years ago. So this doesn't just confirm presence, it confirms structured human life, culture.
We're talking about Mungo man and Mungo woman.
We are. And Mungo woman, for instance, showed clear evidence of cremation. So that indicates that sophisticated funerary rituals were being practiced 42,000 years ago.
Let's just pause on that number for a second. 42,000 years. When you read conventional world history, you often start with the Neolithic Revolution, the first cities in Mesopotamia, maybe Sumer, around 6,000 years ago?
If that, yeah.
This timeline predates those foundational moments of so-called Western civilization by 35,000 years. That synthesis, that's the core takeaway here. The Australian continent is home to a monumental, sustained timeline of human life.
It just speaks to the resilience, the sheer adaptability of these first populations. They arrived during a period of massive environmental change. They adapted to shifting sea levels, expanding deserts, changing megafauna, and they didn't just survive, they thrived. They established a culture that endured.
And that incredible antiquity is exactly what leads us into our next section, this idea of cultural longevity and societal complexity. Because this wasn't just a group of people surviving, right? They established what is Well, it's universally characterized in your sources as one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth.
And that continuity is not monolithic. That's so important. One of the first things that struck me pulling these sources together is just the sheer diversity that was present at the time of first contact.
Right.
We often talk about Aboriginal culture as if it's one thing.
As one unit.
Yeah. But the reality is that the sources paint a picture of a mosaic of societies.
So how diverse are we talking?
Enormously. The sources, they clearly document the existence of at least 250 different language groups across the continent.
Whoa.
And that's not 250 dialects. These are 250 distinct languages, sometimes as different from each other as English is from Russian.
I mean, just imagine the internal political structures, the social protocols, the boundaries you'd need to maintain that kind of linguistic separation over millennia.
In a nomadic or semi-nomadic context, no less, it's incredible.
And this diversity, it wasn't just linguistic, it was economic too. The sources mention these population estimates. They range from 300,000 all the way up to 3 million people before British settlement.
Right.
And regardless of the exact number, that population managed the land using these highly diverse economies, all tailored to their specific environment, from the desert to the tropics.
And what tied all these diverse groups together, regardless of their immediate economic practices, was this profound shared framework of the dreaming. And we really need to define that term because it's so much more than just stories.
Okay, so based on the sources, how should we understand the dreaming?
The dreaming is the foundation of everything. Its law, its creation, its moral order. It describes the period when ancestral beings moved across the land and created everything. The landscape, the laws, the relationship between humans, animals, the physical world. It's history, religion, and a map all at once. A guide to resource management and social conduct.
And it was passed down purely through oral tradition. Songs, ceremonies, dance, paintings. To maintain that for 40,000 years, that's an unparalleled feat of cultural memory.
It really is.
That deep connection wasn't just spiritual. It was intrinsically linked to sophisticated resource management. And this is where we really have to challenge our assumptions about pre-contact societies. Their interaction with the environment was anything but passive.
Absolutely not. The sources detail these specific practices that show specialized generational ecological knowledge. The most famous example, of course, is fire stick farming.
Controlled burning.
Controlled systematic burning. This was not just setting fires randomly, it was a highly sophisticated technique. They used it to clear undergrowth, to promote the growth of specific edible plants, to attract game to new nutritious growth.
And crucially, to prevent massive, catastrophic wildfires.
Exactly. It sounds like active land engineering, doesn't it? They were shaping the ecosystem to sustain them, not just taking what nature randomly provided.
And that's a much better way to put it.
Yeah.
They were cultivating the landscape.
Precisely. And that's just one example. We also find evidence of complex engineered fish farming systems, especially in the Gunditjmara area in Victoria. There, they adapted volcanic channels into these intricate eel traps and aquaculture systems.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the construction of semi-permanent shelters in areas that were rich in resources. When you start seeing evidence of housing and aquaculture, it just fundamentally changes the definition of nomadic life.
Right. And that distinction, that difference between simple foraging and active management, that's why the sources seem to struggle with the simple labels we try to apply. They note that these practices get called hunter-gatherer, agricultural, natural cultivation, intensification.
It just forces us to acknowledge that these labels are, well, they're often too restrictive, too simple. The system they developed was an adaptive continuum. If a society is intentionally modifying its environment, using fire to promote grazing lands, building traps to ensure a sustained fish supply, they are, in fact, exercising a form of sophisticated agriculture.
Even if there are no plows or fences.
Exactly. The deep insight here is that their economic practices were perfectly adapted to the long-term, low-intensity management of a massive, fragile continent.
And that complex relationship with the mainland environment, that wasn't the only form of sophisticated life in the region. We need to shift our focus north to the distinct maritime culture of the Torres Strait Islander people. Your sources say they first settled their islands at least 2,500 years ago.
Yeah, and this separation is really critical for you to note. They are culturally and linguistically distinct from mainland Aboriginal peoples. They occupy the islands between the tip of Queensland and Papua New Guinea.
And their entire livelihood was defined by the water.
It was. They were expert seafarers, relying heavily on the rich resources of their coral reefs and seas.
But their relationship with the land was different too, right? More focused on horticulture than the mainland's fire stick strategies.
Yes. They mastered seasonal horticulture, particularly yams and taro, things that were suitable for that tropical island environment. In fact, the sources point out that by the 1300s, there's clear evidence of agricultural development and the appearance of structured villages on some of the larger islands.
It's a settled, complex life, centuries before European ships arrived.
Dentures.
And this brings us to a part of the history that just shatters any notion of isolation. For a very long time, particularly along the northern coast, the continent was engaged in cross-cultural trade and contact. This wasn't some static land waiting for Europe to show up.
Not at all. It was part of a dynamic maritime region. And the primary evidence for this external engagement, which predated permanent European settlement, was the interaction with the Makasan trip hangers.
Okay, for our listener, who exactly were the Makasan Tripangs?
The Makasans were sophisticated maritime traders from Sulawesi, which is in present-day Indonesia, and the term trephanger refers to what they were after. Trepang, or sea cucumbers.
Right.
For centuries, these traders would sail south on the monsoon winds, arrive in northern Australia to fish and process the trepang, which was then dried and highly, highly valued in the markets of China.
So this wasn't just a brief, hello, how are you? This was an established, long-standing economic relationship. What did the Makasans trade with the local Aboriginal groups?
It was a substantial exchange. It lasted for at least a century and a half, maybe longer. The Makasans traded practical goods that had a profound impact on local life. Metal, like iron for making tools and spears, but also tobacco, rice, even cloth.
And in return,
In return, they relied on local Aboriginal groups for labor, for their knowledge of the coastal waters, and, of course, for help gathering the trepang.
so the Aboriginal groups in the north were integrated into an international trade network that stretched all the way to East Asia. Did this leave a lasting cultural mark?
Oh, it absolutely did, and that's the most powerful insight here. The impact wasn't just economic. You can see Makasan influence in the adoption of certain technologies, the introduction of some foreign words into local languages, and even in rock and bark art, which depicts the distinctive Makasan sailing vessels, the praus.
So it was a deep connection.
So deep that it established a complex system of treaties and protocols between the local communities and the visitors. It proves that Northern Australia was already part of a connected world economy long before Captain Cook ever sailed past.
That's such a crucial point to synthesize. So what does this all mean? When we look at all this evidence, the staggering antiquity proven by Lake Mungo, the cultural memory of the dreaming, the environmental mastery of fire stick farming, the external connections with the Makasans, it just paints a picture that is absolutely incompatible with any view of Australia as an empty or primitive continent.
It speaks to profound human adaptability and, a sophisticated political organization that was required to manage all those elements: internal diversity, deep time continuity, and external trade all at the same time.
So this deep dive into your sources,
Mm-hmm.
it paints this breathtaking picture of extraordinary human longevity and profound cultural diversity.
Mm.
It's not a single monolithic story of Aboriginal history. It's more like 250 plus distinct, complex histories, each one spanning tens of thousands of years on this single dynamic continent.
And that leads us to a really important question for you to consider as you process all of this information. If we connect the dots, if we connect the existence of complex agricultural practices like fish farming, the presence of semi-permanent settlements, and this long-standing external trade with the moccasins, we have to fundamentally challenge how we typically define pre-contact or pre-literate societies in global history.
Right.
The sources demand that we redefine our understanding of complexity, that we acknowledge that true civilization is measured not by written text or stone monuments, but by the ability of a culture to sustain itself, its law, and its unique relationship with its environment across deep time. So the question to leave you with is this: what assumptions about human history do you need to let go of now, knowing this history?